You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron, live with Ethan Hristodoulou.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Greeks Gridiron. I am Ethan Hristodoulou, and today we are answering a question that I think is starting to build as each passing week goes by and the Minnesota Vikings continue to find success in the absence of Kirk Cousins. And that question today, and I'm posing it all to you as well, is should the Minnesota Vikings move on from Kirk Cousins in favor of new quarterback Josh Dobbs? This is something that I think, if all continues to go well, is probably going to gain some traction each and every single passing week. So it's early, I'm well aware, but let me hear your thoughts on this. I'm going to break this down, kind of show you why I'm bringing this question up to you all, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions, so make sure you fire away in that comment section down below. But starting with just Josh Dobbs, taking a look at what he's done to this point in the season with the Minnesota Vikings in just a short couple of weeks. He's led the Vikings now to 2 straight victories. Obviously, he came in as a starter this past week and the week prior coming in to relieve an injured Jaren Hall, shocking the world, pulling off a massive comeback victory, and then doing it again with another win this past week against the Saints. Now, in these 2 games, we're looking at a QB rating of 101.5, 426 passing yards, 3 touchdowns to 0 interceptions, with a completion percentage of 67.2. That is a very high number, mind you, higher than his season average to this point when you consider what he was dealing with over in Arizona. On top of that, 110 yards rushing. He has a couple of scores on the ground as well. He does have 3 fumbles from that first game, but when you consider all the circumstances that went into that first game there and just the kind of off-script thing that they were doing with the offense when he came in, again, didn't really know anybody on the team. He was just there playing football with them because of circumstance. I don't really knock that against him too much. This was all done, remind you, minus Justin Jefferson. This is a team that is absent their number 1 wide receiver, who a lot of people would argue is wide receiver 1 in the NFL. I'd be in that group as well. And appears that he is very motivated after watching the last couple of weeks to get himself back in the action with the Vikings. And I, for one, am very excited to see what this offense could look like with Josh Dobbs doing what he's been doing all season long, plus a healthy Justin Jefferson. When you look at just the totality of work that Dobbs has done in terms of just his play, his numbers, everything that he's done, the signed literally right before the start of the season to be quarterback 1 for the Arizona Cardinals during that stretch with no actual quarterback because Kyler Murray was hurt and they didn't really want to turn to Clayton Tune and whoever else they had on their roster at the time. He wound up to this point amassing nearly 2,000 yards. He has 11 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. His season average in terms of completion percentage is 63.5%. He does have 368 yards rushing on the ground and 5 touchdowns, 2-7 as a starter. Remember, he came in relief for Jaren Hall, so you don't technically count that. I would personally say, though, he's 3-7 as a quarterback, though. Leading the Cardinals, if you remember, to an improbable victory over the Dallas Cowboys after they were coming off of an absolute whacking of the New York Giants. So, with all that in mind, we know what Joshua Dobbs has been doing, but why the question? Should the Vikings consider maybe moving on from Kirk Cousins? Well, first we have to take a look at Kirk Cousins. He's 35 years old, not getting any younger, obviously. He's currently recovering from an Achilles injury, which at one point in time was considered a career ender for a lot of people, but science has clearly progressed. People are coming back from these injuries. We have seen some circumstances where people continue to re-injure those Achilles, or it's just one of those things where they're never quite the same. One of those two. We have not really seen like a full-blown, really successful comeback. I think Adrian Peterson might be someone that, if I remember correctly, he either had an ACL or an Achilles injury. I can't remember off the top of my head. Feel free to correct me if I'm right and wrong about here, Vikings fans. He's probably the lone example of a guy who really came back to full peak, and if not better than his peak, following a massive and devastating injury. If I'm remembering correctly, though, I think that was an Achilles. I could be wrong on that. On top of just age and injury circumstance, Kirk Cousins' current deal with the Minnesota Vikings is up at the end of this season. And throughout the entire time that he's been in Minnesota since joining the team in 2018, he's been signing fully guaranteed contracts. Not a single penny has gone unearned in everything that he has made through the entirety of his time, 6 years now in Minnesota. The current deal he has at this moment, earning him about $33 million annually, obviously not the exact number, but per average annual. And you can certainly expect, with all things in the way money has gone in the NFL, especially in the last decade or so, that number is probably going to rise, especially if he can come back and play and he's ready to go. I don't know if training camp is probably too soon, but if he's ready to get himself going for the preseason, be able to take some snaps and get ready with whatever offense he ends up working with, be it in Minnesota or elsewhere, that number is probably going to rise. I could realistically see a scenario where if, hypothetically speaking, things go well with Josh Dobbs and there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the recovery time and just how much longer it's going to take Kirk Cousins to come back, that maybe they let Kirk Cousins test free agency and just kind of see how things work out with him out there. I don't really know how many teams are going to be willing to commit such a massive amount of money to someone who doesn't know their system, is working back from a fairly devastating injury, and is willing to take a 30+ million risk. The only team that I really think that makes sense of doing that, if it's because if in this scenario, I'm expecting that if he hits free agency, he probably gets to take his time and recover and then make a decision later in the summer. That's just kind of how I look at that, because again, that's a very large number to commit to, because again, he's been signing fully guaranteed deals. That number is probably going to be higher if he can play, and teams are going to want to know he's healthy and actually see him be able to throw a football around and be on that leg and, drive off, all that stuff. They're going to want to be able to see all that. So realistically, the only team that I feel would actually be comfortable with that number out of the gate is Minnesota, because they at least know that he knows their system and they know what he brings to the table within their system and everyone that they have there. So that is something that I think is worth considering. Now, Kirk Cousins aside, there are two players on this roster right now in Minnesota that could potentially benefit from there being no Kirk Cousins next year, simply because of how much money he eats up on the team. Those two people, Danielle Hunter and Justin Jefferson. We saw a decent amount of that little saga going on with Justin Jefferson and not getting the contract that he wanted this past summer, and I'm sure it's only going to get louder as we move into the next season here. He's obviously going to be due for a massive contract extension, and then Danielle Hunter, he's someone that I honestly at this point think, while I could understand why maybe Minnesota opts to move on from him, is clearly thriving in what they're doing on defense this year, and he's only 29. I know that's kind of, getting up there in age in NFL terms, but he's on pace for a career season right now. 11 sacks, 20 pressures, 48 total tackles, 14 of them being for a loss. He has 3 forced fumbles, and he's played 88% of defensive snaps possible this season, a career best for him. That's all per Pro Football Reference. Not to mention, he's been a good run defender his entire career. Really strong at setting the edge on those run plays. This is someone who is an all-around player who's kind of having a resurgence right now in a contract year. Not too surprising, all things considered. Now, he is 29, so he's a little bit older, like I said, but I could see him signing a solid 3, maybe even 4-year deal. We've seen some defensive linemen, especially the really talented ones, take it to the next level, or at least keep themselves at that high level well into their early 30s and sometimes even middle 30s. So while 29 is older, it's not necessarily, it's not the end of his career. He could very well be hitting a dominant 5-year stretch. It's definitely possible. And it's not like Danielle Hunter has been someone who hasn't performed in Minnesota his entire career. He's just on pace right now for a career best, and it just happens to be at 29 years old. When you look at the average annual number that players are earning right now, as far as edge rushers goes, or guys that are just pure pass rushers on the outside, Nick Bosa tops the list at $34 million. TJ Watt is making about $28 million a year. Joey Bosa's at 27, Myles Garrett at 25, Montez Sweat just signed a $24.5 million deal with the Chicago Bears, Rashawn Gary just signed a $24 million deal, Khalil Mack still working on a $23.5 million deal he signed with Chicago, Max Crosby got himself a $23.5, Bradley Chubb sitting on $22 million. Those are the top 9 guys in the NFL right now in terms of average annual that are the guys that set the edge for defenses here. Now, if I had to pick somewhere within this range, there is a strong possibility that he's pushing closer to that higher half margin than the bottom, just because he's leading the NFL right now in sacks. Like, he is on a tear. He is running things right now. So with that in mind, I'm thinking he's probably looking at somewhere along the lines of maybe like 24 to 25 million per year if he's signing a massive deal. With Kirk Cousins in Minnesota, I do not think that deal is possibly done. Not in the slightest. It just seems like too much money to keep Kirk Cousins, to keep Danielle Hunter, and to keep Justin Jefferson all in the same building. It's just way too much money, especially because, like I said, that 33 million guaranteed, that number is probably getting closer to 40 million, maybe not quite 40 million, or maybe it does hit 40 million. Like someone like Daniel Jones is earning $40 million on his contract. Why shouldn't somebody like Kirk Cousins be making that much money? You get my drift here? So you keep that in mind. If you lose Kirk Cousins, it opens up a lot of money to bring back somebody who is currently on career pacing numbers right now in terms of just entire defensive play. It's not just one specific number here or there. It's pretty much all the numbers for him. And he is dominating and fairly quietly. And I would consider that partly because of the fact that the Vikings had a tough start to the season. If they had started off and won some of the games they lost tightly in like tight games, this is a Vikings team that's probably being talked about a little bit more. And on top of that, Hunter's probably getting far more respect around the league for what he's doing. And then again, as I mentioned, when you look at Justin Jefferson's situation, he is obviously going to be due for a contract extension soon. You probably want to get that done sooner rather than later. You don't want that to just continue to be a problem going into this offseason. I feel like an extension for Justin Jefferson is paramount to get done this offseason. So he's going to set the market for wide receivers right now. Tyreek Hill tops the list at $30 million per year. Devontae Adams right behind him at $28 million a year. I'm expecting that number to go up. It's probably going to be 31, 32, 33 million, somewhere along those lines. Justin Jefferson is going to get every single penny he possibly can, and deservedly so. So again, these are two guys that minus Kirk Cousins makes their contract situation a lot better. Now, with all that, we have to look at what Josh Dobbs could potentially earn and how this would all make sense. Now, as far as what Dobbs can actually make contract-wise, I think it really just comes down to how far this Minnesota Vikings team can go with him under center. The Vikings are obviously riding a 5-game winning streak right now, and Josh Dobbs has led them to 2 of those 5 victories in the last couple of weeks. If this team finishes somewhere with a record around 500, maybe a game or 2 over, let's say hypothetically 9-8, 10-7, they don't make the playoffs though for whatever that reason may be, you're looking at a pretty decent number. I think you're starting to push like, and if all goes well, like he has a good season, he's in large part a reason for that push to 9-8, 10-7, or maybe they go like 8-9, something like that. If schedule gets tough, whatever the situation may be, you're still looking at a good case for making like 20 to 25, maybe more million a year, considering the way quarterback contracts are working right now for starters that are productive. Again, somehow Daniel Jones is making $40 million a year right now. Riddle me that. If they're talking above 500, and I'm thinking like 10-7, 11-6, something along those lines, if they really make a push for the playoffs, now we're getting into a conversation where he's probably supposed to be making something along the lines of that 25, 30, 35 million, maybe even that 40 million that we saw Daniel Jones get just this past season. If he finds reasonable success, there is a good case to be made that he should be somewhere in that ballpark. And at that point, you're starting to get closer to what you were paying Kirk Cousins. Now, I don't know if his lack of starting experience and lack of actual production in terms of just the longevity of his career may hinder some of the value. I could see him somewhere along that 25 to 30 million mark, which again is going to be lower than the 35, 40 million you're probably looking at that Kirk Cousins needs to make, unless he somehow gets convinced to come back on a 1-year prove-it deal, which it just does not really make sense to me when you consider the situation that Kirk Cousins has had while being in Minnesota. So you'll think about that. Let's roll the dice, 25, 30 million. You're saving about 10, maybe $15 million off of what you would be paying Kirk Cousins. You can allot that money to the contracts that you, again, are going to be due if you want to keep Danielle Hunter and obviously Justin Jefferson, who's going to inevitably get paid around. I firmly think that if you're moving on from Kirk Cousins, you have a strong case that needs to be made for keeping Josh Dobbs around, especially if all goes well. It opens up things that you can do with your roster. You don't have to spend as much. And I'm not saying that Josh Dobbs isn't going to be worth maybe more than that. It's just when you see, like, if someone like Daniel Jones, where you consider the upper echelons of quarterback contracts have gone, made $40 million, you could say, well, why isn't Josh Dobbs going to get that number? Well, I would probably say, and I'm sure Giants fans and a lot of people in New York would agree with me, that contract was a bit of a mistake. And he should probably have been somewhere around like 25, 30 million at best. I know things went really well for them last year, and that was probably part of the reason why that number got inflated the way it did. But that contract kind of looks like a fleecing right now. And that's no offense to anyone. It's just a matter of, this is the facts. This is how that money is, how high that number is right now in terms of money, and the situation that New York is in right now. That contract is not being, the Giants are not getting their end of the deal in that deal, I guess you could say. So we get to the final question. Should the Vikings consider moving on from Cousins in favor of Joshua Dobbs? And I think the answer to that question comes down to, if the team succeeds, then yes. If the team fails, then no. Failure would be you maybe win another game or two through the rest of the season. That's probably what you're looking at. If we're talking above 500, maybe 8-9 at worst, serious playoff push or potential where you're in the conversation, or you even make a berth into the playoffs, at that point, you're assuming Josh Dobbs is having a good season, one that with the pieces around him already, a good offensive line when they're healthy, some really talented wide receiver, Jordan Addison and Justin Jefferson, could be a very dynamic duo for the next 4 or 5 years, somewhere along that line at minimum. If they wind up keeping Addison around much longer than that, it could be even longer. So we're talking at least 4 to 5 years of a pretty dynamic duo at wide receiver, not to mention TJ Hawkinson's over there and a very pass-happy offense where Josh Dobbs, with his legs, can help mitigate the lack of a run game that the Vikings have had for the last year, minus Dalvin Cook. So again, I say if the Vikings find success, you have got to consider letting Kirk Cousins recover from his injury, find a new team elsewhere where he can make as much money as he wants, probably go somewhere that's a contender as well, that feels like maybe they're a quarterback away, and you can start to look towards the future with someone that's 28 years old, obviously a little bit on the, again, older side, quote unquote, in NFL terms, but quarterbacks, we've seen them extend their careers well into their 30s. If you could get 7-8 years out of Josh Dobbs, and it's a successful 7-8 years with a guy that right now obviously plays some of his game off his athleticism, but is a clearly very smart guy who can pick up a system on the fly and be successful at it at that, I think that's a success, and it is definitely something that I would be here for seeing. I like what's going on right now in Minnesota. I don't think you can doubt Josh Dobbs much more. At this point, he has been thrown into 2 different situations on the fly, found immediate success with a very talented Vikings team, and at times was doing his very best to will a Cardinals team that is clearly missing some pieces right now. And at the beginning of the season, kind of looked like they were just going to, coast their way through a year and wait for Kyler Murray to get back to a true 100% rust knocked off and look more towards next year than anything else. And with their record being where it is right now, that's pretty much what the case was. But Josh Dobbs looked really good in spots. If he can continue this pace, I think he's going to find a lot more success in Minnesota than he did in the first half of the season with the Cardinals, and I'm ready to watch it. So give me a yes, move on from Kirk Cousins if things go well. If we bottom out and we only see maybe 1 or 2 more victories, obviously the answer would be no. But if you find yourself making a push for the playoffs or even finding a way as the number 7 or 6 seed in the playoffs, you've got to consider a future with Josh Dobbs. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below, but that is it for me. I greatly appreciate you taking your time to watch, but that is it for me. I will see you all next time. Have a good one.